This is the fourth part on Holy Communion. I'll share my screen. Okay, fourth part, who receives this sacrament rightly? The reason why this question is raised is because at the time that Luther lived, about 500 years ago, people really tried to avoid Holy Communion as much as possible. They went maybe once a year and only because they were required to. People were really nervous about taking God's own body and blood into themselves. They doubted very much that they were worthy of it. How can I possibly be good enough to hold God's body and blood in my mouth and then chew it and swallow it? In addition to that, there was the requirement that people would go to confession to a priest before they could take Holy Communion. So that's kind of the context in which Luther is asking this question and trying to give a fresh answer. So who receives this sacrament rightly? Luther answers, fasting and bodily preparations are fine physical practices, but a person is worthy and well fit who has faith in these words, given and shed for you for the forgiveness of sins. But whoever disbelieves these words or doubts them is unworthy and unfit, for the words for you demand nothing but believing. So let's look at this part by part. First of all, fasting and bodily preparations, those were things that people would do to get ready for Holy Communion. And in some places they still do. In some churches, they make a big deal of fasting beforehand. If you would like to fast before Holy Communion, that's fine. You don't have to, but if you find that it focuses your attention, as Luther says, those are fine physical practices. But the main thing to come to communion is not to have done something on the outside that makes you look like a righteous person, but to be someone who approaches the sacrament with faith, hearing the promise that God has to offer and desiring to accept it. So a person who is worthy and well fit is not someone who is perfect or not someone who looks religious, but someone who has faith in the words that God speaks, given and shed for you for the forgiveness of sins. Again, it's important to remember that faith isn't some kind of special work where you suspend all your doubts or don't ask any questions about your faith or pretend like you magically just accept what is said without any challenge. It is hard to believe. I mean, Christ's own body and blood, God's own body and blood, that's a kind of surprising thing. But the point here is not so much whether or not you have some sort of objective conviction that God can really fit into bread and wine. The most important thing for you is to understand that this is how God is reaching out to you. Often people want a religious experience. They want to hear God speak to them or to touch them or give them a vision. Well, in fact, God is very generous in giving us these visions. He does it every time we have Holy Communion. In fact, every time we hear his word and hear preaching and good spiritual music and meaningful conversation with friends, God reaches us in all those ways. But one way you can be sure that God is reaching to you is to come to Holy Communion, because that's where you hear the very words Jesus said at his Last Supper that he intended all Christians everywhere to hear. This is my body and blood given and shed for you for the forgiveness of your sins. So when you are coming up to the communion table, that is the promise being offered to you. And it's important then not for you to have a completely doubt-free kind of mind in the sense of not asking any questions. What's important is for you to desire to come to what God has to offer to you and to trust that God is reaching out to you through Christ, offering you himself. So the contrast here is, but whoever disbelieves these words or doubts them is unworthy and unfit. Again, it's important to understand what's meant here. This is not meant for worried Christians who really want to believe in God, but maybe have questions about science or about other religions or have had a hard time in life and sometimes wonder if God really loves them. That's not what Luther is addressing here. Actually, those kind of people, Luther really encourages to come to communion and hear God's promise offered to them. He's talking about people who deliberately come up not believing in it, being offended by it, thinking it's all a joke, not taking it seriously, not being a Christian in any way at all. That's what he is talking against here. So the communion is not something to be abused or used or to treat it as light entertainment. But if you truly desire God, if you know that your life is out of order and you really want to be with God, even though your mind suggests things that raise doubts in your mind, or you're living wrong and you know that you're living wrong and you're trying to fix it, you are definitely a person who should come to Holy Communion so that you can hear this promise of God and receive the forgiveness of sins. And that's why the conclusion is the words for you demand nothing but believing. That's what you come to communion with, knowing that Jesus is giving it for you. That is enough.